Excellent. Okay. All right. Welcome, Jeff. Yeah, there we go. Adat Shalom Programming.
Fred.
Host.
Yeah. Want to make me host?
You are.
Okay, good.
If you can kick back and make me co-host, that would be great. Hey. But you should absolutely be hosting. And we are working on getting the main thing.
And does anybody else need to be co-host?
I don't think so, at least not yet.
Okay. And what about when people are, you know, I'm going to enable the waiting room.
Enable or disable?
No, I want it enabled for a little while.
Sure? Well, we've got folks. I mean, it's already 8. I'm not terribly
Right.
worried.
I have a question for you though. Are we going to spotlight? I don't have a list of the readers.
Absolutely no worry. The people are local, so I'm gonna be cameraman as soon as I get it set up. So
okay, so they'll all be in the room.
I believe so. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, so I've got your document.
Right. Okay, great, and thank you. So to those who did join already, welcome. It will be a relatively passive experience, but we do feel free to speak up at any point, and we are honored that you are with us. We'll start in a couple of minutes. Okay. Ya na 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 na. Ya na 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 na. Ya na na na. Ya na na na. Thank you. Nine, nine, nine. Nine, 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 nine. Ya na 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 nine, 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 nine. Ya na 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 nine, nine, nine. Ya na 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 nine, 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 nine. Ya na 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 nine, nine, nine. Ya nine, nine, nine. Ya nine, nine, nine. Ya nine, nine, nine. Ya nine, nine, nine. All right. One moment. Hey, glad to see. All right. Oh, this keeps lifting. That'll work. Does it lock? Yeah. Yeah, this way, I think. Okay. Should be okay with just batteries for the moment. All right. We are briefly facing me, and in a moment we are going to face the Kahal of almost a minion already. Welcome, everyone. Let me ask to those who are remote, are you able to see and hear reasonably well? All right, 1 second. Let me get to gallery view.
Yeah.
Thumbs, yes? Thank you, BJ. Okay, wonderful. Honored to have you all with us. Huge appreciation to Martha Hare as our Zoom Gabbai and to our readers. Wanted to just begin with a temperature taking. We are gathered now in a way that we couldn't have last Tisha B'Av. We're just getting used to being back unmasked with each other after a global devastation. Done yet. And with racism and anti-Semitism and hate of all sorts, there's so much about this year's Tisha B'Av that feels close to home, perhaps in a way that in some past years it hasn't. So I just wondered if anyone has been thinking these themes to themselves and is willing to give voice a little bit to the uniqueness of Tisha B'Av 5781. So the floor is anyone's, Zoom or room, who would like to offer.
I can start.
I'm just going to do this each time. Here we go. We're going to keep lifting and figuring this out. No worries. Keep going. Yes, Larry.
Yeah. So last year was rough in certain ways. I think for all of us, it was a very hard summer. It was a very scary summer. And Tisha B'Av last summer just seemed just so like we're right. I mean, it's not as bad as it was, in 586, but it was very scary. And so how do you make meaning out of Tisha B'Av last year? And it was just really, I really learned from a lot of brilliant people who were really wrestling with that question in very rich ways. But I know when I was called upon to lead Shabbos service right before Tisha B'Av, it was just very hard for me to do it as a mensch at some level because all this stuff was so scary. Now, for this year, I think dealing with coming out of, at least for a little while, out of the COVID scare and all, I mean, we're still like not out of the woods, but it's not as bad. And I think a lot of my energy went into Pesach this year, you know, and looking at the freedom aspect of it. And even, God knows, Shavuos maybe, I don't know, but Tisha B'Av, I'm feeling like I got to be careful this year. You know, it's just too scary, and I'm just not going there. And, you know, there's this 3 weeks you're supposed to really make yourself miserable at some, I mean, I don't get that yet. And I just can't do it. And I was going to read Frankl tomorrow, and I don't want to read Viktor Frankl tomorrow. You know, I want to read things that are not as scary to me. So that's where I am.
Thank you. Amen. I will say, if we're going to go into the histories of our ancestors who faced down persecution, and Viktor Frankl has too scary an interpretation, right? You know, one of the more uplifting to come out of. So, but I hear you, and I think a lot of us do. Okay, I'm going to fix the Ständer, maybe, and then over to George. 1 second.
Oh dear. Fred? All right, hang in there, everybody. Hmm.
Radio.
it scares me. Because the strength of democracy rests on the strength of bonds between and among the people. That's what really depends on. That's what, so I am very, very concerned and lamenting what was and hoping that I am looking at it from a too difficult perspective and I am wrong, but I'm not satisfied that I am at all.
Echa. Those in the Zoom verse, you lost us for a little bit?
Yeah, we did.
Okay, apologies. They missed the middle of what George was talking about, the frightening rise of autocracy. His son is doing academic work around it. We're all reading it, we're all feeling it, and how that brings it home. Is that fair?
Sure. It's as fair as you can do in 5 minutes after I've spouted for all that time.
Right. With apologies, I had a RAM crisis last night on my computer. And so we are simply going to use the phone. It will be great. It has worked for Shabbatot. Is the sound and sight relatively clear at this moment? Beautiful. Okay, then we will be setting it up, coming soon to a seat near you if you are alive and if you are reading. Echa, chapter 1, traditionally is findable on sefaria.org or in any full Chumash or Tanakh, as BJ is modeling for us. Thank you. Where of course you will find it somewhere toward, but not all the way at the back in the writings rather than the prophets. And if you are here, we have the booklets for you as well. We are also going to intersperse with these modern takes. And Martha, as our gracious screen sharer among others, is going to help us when we get there. We're going to do chapter 1 just to set the tone. And then in between full or partial chapters thereafter, we will have opportunity for some more reflection with prompts in the handout that is here, as well as what Martha will share on screen. This is meant to be halfway between a traditional recital of Echa and an opportunity to connect and to process the experience, the uniqueness of Tisha B'Av this time around.
Right in here.
Hmm?
Set that right in here.
Ah, thank you. Perfect. Great. Okay. Wait. Hold on. Wait, no, it's on lift. Hold on, that turned it off. There we go. Okay, here we go. Wait, it says, yeah, but wait, no, but video is, that was beautiful, except there we go. Okay. All right. I get by with a little help from my friend.
Put that there and spin it around. Yes, neat.
Okay. All right. Return the Shenda. Waiting for that. Sorry, it's Tisha B'Av. I shouldn't. All right. Echa, chapter 1. The time of Jeremiah, the time of destruction, the time prophesied by Isaiah in this morning's Haftarah, which was written 120 years prior, in the time of King Chizkiyahu, who did well enough to stave off the inevitable. But that which was prophesied, the downfall of Judah, happens. And this is written in that historical moment. Aleph? Oh, Chana was Aleph. Wait, right. Do we have, is Chana on screen by chance? Our Aleph reader is
where our computer connection is. Anyone happen to know Aleph? Echa, yes, right. Let me take a look. Huh. Yeah. Mhm. You're way better at Echatrop than I am.
Okay.
If you're our ringer, if you're willing, all right, we can just do the first few psukim if you like. Thank you.
First time?
Sure.
More or less.
Mhm.
איכה ישבה בדד, העיר בת ים הייתה כאלמנה, רבתי בגויים, צרתי במדינות הייתה למס, בכל תבכה בלילה, ודמעתה לחיה, אין לה מנחם מכל אוהביה. כל רעיך בגדובה היו לה לאויבים. גלתה יהודה מעונית ומרוע עבודה, היא ישבה בגויים לא מצאה מנוח. כל רודפיה השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה נחי, בתולתיה נוגות והיא מעלה. והיו צריה לראש, אויביה שאלו, כי אדוני הוגה על רוב פשעיה, עולליה, הלכו שבי לפני צער.
Thank you.
We get started.
Awesome. Toda. All right. You gotta get this. Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. With appreciation to Ken for getting us going. Echa badad ha'ir Rabatiya. How alone sits the city? There was a passage in today's Haftarah that caught me, which was Isaiah chapter 1, again written long before this, that uses the same image of Echa, which is a poetic and rare form for how. So whenever you hear that, there's a little bit of a traditional Jewish hyperlink to this text. The idea of a city being a certain way, a city destroyed, a city in ruins. Some years, it just feels like an image. But I'm going to ask us to tune back to Tisha B'Av in 2002, when 9/11 was fresh in our minds. And that sense of vulnerability that intellectually we always knew it could happen here, and suddenly it did. And then think to January 6th of this past year. And while our temple was not in ruins, Baruch Hashem, that vulnerability is very much there. Wonder if there's a couple volunteers who would read. This is from Rabbi Gail Leibovitz at the West Coast Conservative Seminary, the Ziegler
Institute, who reminds us, she opens, I cut this part out of the play acting of Tisha B'Av at traditional Jewish summer camps. I wonder, just looking around, how many of us were at a summer camp that did Tisha B'Av in some performative way, right? So there's as a response to that, interestingly, there's been articles and suggestions like no more making a temple out of cardboard boxes and destroying it in front of the kids, right? Like all of those ways that to try to dramatize, to try to make it as tangible as possible, there's a very fine line in pedagogy between instilling knowledge and connection and instilling PTSD. But this is kind of building on that and going where I just introduced us. Each year is different. This year, perhaps vary. So maybe two readers to alternate paragraphs of this is page 1 of the handout, which Martha will now be able to either screen share or put chunk by chunk in chat, whichever. There you go. Thank you. If you can make it a little fuller screen so it's as legible as possible, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much, Martha. Great. Here we go. Take it.
What we were being taught to do at Ramah and other camps with similar rites is a kind of sacred play acting. As adults, we can tend to become jaded. Routine may take over. We find ways not to be overwhelmed by the horror so that we can live our lives. Or we simply wonder how important it is that a way of Judaism that is now almost entirely foreign to us perished with the temple, or even to what degree we should be mourning at all.
Alternate.
But every so often, there are years that remind me that what we are doing when we participate in these practices is not play, not exactly acting, but a sacred task. I try every year, I really do, a bit of sacred play acting. We turn down the lights and sit on the floor, sing in a minor key, and try to mourn. Or if I am feeling especially ambitious, try to imagine a city burning down around.
One recent difficult year, it was a lot less hard to imagine sitting with my family and neighbors in a bomb shelter, listening for booms, sitting with my family and neighbors in an overcrowded classroom of a school that is supposed to serve as a refuge, sitting with my family with no more shelter from the elements than a tent in a desert city that didn't even exist a year or two ago, actually being without power or wondering how long the power will last, actually being concerned over my next meal, actually worrying that something will blow up or burn down around me, or knowing that it already has, actually mourning people I know who have been cut down in the violence.
Hold on, just sorry, just one quick moment. Halfway through to note, she was talking about 2014 in Israel as someone who lived there. And those of us who have friends and family and have been through wave after wave of bombings and intifadas get it. But of course, many of the world's hotspots can speak to this, and sometimes it comes home here to roost as well. So with that in mind, that it is fresh elsewhere and increasingly fresh here, that's where we pick up in the middle.
There has also been 2019, when Jews around the United States gathered on the morning of Tisha B'Av to protest the detention in terrible conditions and deportation of refugees, many from violence and loneliness in Central America or civil war in the Middle East. Alongside friends, neighbors, members of our congregation, my colleagues and my students, my husband, and I read Echad together outside the Metropolitan Detention Center in downtown Los Angeles. Or, of course, last year, each of us sitting home alone or with only our closest family, frightened, isolated, lonely, perhaps even sick or grieving ourselves, may have been one of those years for many of us.
Okay, so now the big question.
Why does this matter? Why should we be doing this? As one powerful answer, I want to bring you the words of my intellectual inspiration and dear friend, Dr. Rabbi Rachel Adler. Meaning is not just what happens in our heads. Meaning is also enacted, and we are talking about how it is properly enacted. When we perform being too shattered to eat, drink, bathe on Tisha B'Av, we are teaching ourselves both what grief should look like and what is worth grieving for.
So hold on that for a moment. We'll come back to it. What grief might look like and what is worth grieving for. Okay, last paragraph.
Surely the brokenness of our world, the cruelties we human beings continue to inflict on each other, the insecurity that can always lurk just under the surface of our lives, even when we think we are in a place of comfort, surely that is worth acknowledging and grieving and enacting. Surely, year by year, we need to ask ourselves, what in our own history and that of the world is worth grieving for? What in our own history, and so too, when inflicted on others, ought to leave us too shattered to eat, drink, bathe for at least a day. Tisha B'Av is the date that our ancestors and our history has given us for this purpose. May a bit of sacred play acting be just real enough to bring us face to face with these questions.
Thank you. So I wonder, thank you so much, and thank you for screen sharing. So with this in mind, what are some of the ways that the play acting, as it were, of Tisha B'Av might be helpful in not only showing how to grieve, but what is worth grieving for? Anyone want to speak to this? George, as loud as you can. I'll be there in a minute with this. Yes.
It sensitizes us to an awareness of what others, thank God, at least some of the time, others are having to endure or not endure and grieve over, so that our hearts will not be closed by the relative comfort in which maybe this year we live.
Thank you. The relative comfort, introducing concepts of differential privilege and all of that, so important all the time and very much on Tisha B'Av. So as a very small symbol of this play acting, as it were, at the end of services this morning, we had the timbrels out. And so I left them here as if they're hanging on the wall unused. Because of course, in traditional mourning rites, we don't sing, we don't dance. We remember Miriam. We remember parties on Saturday night. We remember that we dance. We look at the symbols of it, and we realize that now we don't. And so literally covering it up with the chair that holds the yahrzeit candle, one of the better known symbols, call it play acting, call it the modest mark of respect that is within our limited ability to generate on a regular basis. take a moment to think about the victims. Our greats 2,600 years ago and 1,950 years ago at the hands of the Babylonians and the Romans, but much more recent and all around us as well. So we're play acting and we're doing a lot more. Echa, chapter 2. This is Ken planned as opposed to Ken unplanned. They're both good.
איכה העיר בפה אדוני את בית ציון, השליך משמיים ארץ תפארת ישראל, ולא זכר אדום רגליו ביום אפו, מילה אדוני ולא חמל את כל נאות יעקב, הרס בר בעברתו, מברצי בת יהודה הגיע לארץ, חילל ממלכה ושריה, גדל בחורייה, כל קרן ישראל השיב אחור, ימינו מפני אויב. ויבער ביעקב כאש להבה, אכלה סביב, לך קשתו כאויב, ניצב ימינו כצער, ויהרוג כל מחמדי העיר. באוהל בציון שפך כאש חמתו, היה אדוני כאויב בילה ישראל, בילה כל ארמונותיה שיחת מבצריו, וירב בבת יהודה תעניה ועניה. ויחמוס כגן סוכו, שיחת מועדו. שיקח אדוני בציון מועד בשבת, וינעץ בזעם אפו מלך וכהן. זנח אדוני מזבחו, ניער מקדשו, הזכיר ביד אויב חומות ארמונותיה. כה נתנו בבית אדוני כיום מועד, חשב אדוני להשחית חומת בציון, נטע כאן לא השיב ידו מבעליה, ויעבל חיל וחומה יחדיו ומללו. טבעו בארץ שעריה, איבד ושיבה בריחיה, מלכה ושריה בגויים, אין תורה, גם נביאיה, לא מצאו חזון מאדוני. ישבו לארץ, ימדו זקני בת ציון, העלו עפר על ראשם, חגרו שקים, הורידו לארץ ראשן, בתולת ירושלים. כלו בדמעות עיניי, חמרמרו מעי, נשפך לארץ כבדי, על שבר בת עמי, בעטף עולל ויונק, ברחובות קריה, לאמותם יאמרו, איה דגן ויין, בהתעטפם כחלל רחובות עיר, בהשתפך נפשם אל חיק אמותם. מעידך, מה אדמה לך, הבת ירושלים, מה אשווה לך, ואנחמך, בתולת בת ציון, כי גדול קיים. שברך מאיר פלח, נביאייך חזו לך, שב ותפאר, ולא גילו על עוונך, להשיב שירותך, ויחזו לך, מסעות שווא ומדוכים. צחקו עלייך כפיים, על עוברי דרך, שרקו ועניו ראשם על בת ירושלים, הזאת העיר. שמרו כלילת יופי, משוש לכל הארץ. פצו עלייך פיהם כל אויבייך, שרקו ויחרקו שאין אמרו, בי לנו, אך זה היום, שכבנו מצאנו ראינו, עשה אדוני אשר זמם, ביצע אמרתו אשר ציווה מימי קדם, הרס ולא חמה, וישמח עלייך אויב, הרים קרן שרייך, צעק ליבם אל אדוני, חומת בית בת ציון, הורידי כנחל דמעה יומם ולילה, אל תתני פלוגת לך, אל תדום בת עינך. קומי רוני בלילה, לראש השמועות, שפכי כמים ליבך, נוכח פני אדוני. שאי אליו כפייך, על נפש עוללייך, העטופים ברע בראש חוצות. ראה אדוני והביטה למי עוללת כה. אם תאכלנה נשים פריים עוללי טיפוחים, אם יהרג במקדש אדוני כהן ונביא. שלחו לארץ חוצות נער וזקן, בתולותיי ובחוריי נפלו בחרב, הרגת ביום אפיך, טבחת לא חמרת, תקרח היום מועד מגורי מסביב, ולא היה ביום אף אדוני פליט בשרי, אשר טיפחתי וריביתי אויבי חילם.
Yasher Koach, huge thanks. A lot of text, and whether you follow the Hebrew or not, that minor key is just like Wow. Yes. I noticed something interesting that connects to the text number 3, which we're going to look at in this space before chapter 3. Two lines from the end there can read, Im Yahareg shall be killed b'mikdash, in the sanctuary, Adonai, like my master, the Kohen, the priest, as well as the Navi, the prophet. And that then echoed back at the end of verse 6 that Ken was chanting for us. Vayinatz beza'am apo melech v'chohen. That in madness, in anger, God has spurned both the king and the priest. To the extent that we can talk about proto-democracy or Montesquieu's idea of checks and balances in the old days, these were the three: the priest, the prophet, and the king. And each had a certain check on the authority or the stature of the other. When we think about what tears us apart from within, we think about those, right? The Senate, the House, the Congress, the people, the media, right? The houses, the estates. And there's a certain check and balance among them. When it comes to outside threats, suddenly it's tilted. So everyone but Martha, who spoke so beautifully about it this morning, quick quiz. The second temple was destroyed in the rabbinic imagination because of what overwhelming sin among our people?
Sinat chinam.
Sinat chinam, literally free hatred. Hatred that has no apparent cost. It's the same word used in advertisements, in Israeli circulars, chinam, free, right? Like there's no reason not to go ahead with this. The perception that there's nothing stopping us from hate, free hate, baseless, senseless hatred. And the first temple was destroyed for? Anyone? Anyone? So sinat chinam, the idea of the of our internecine warfare being what did us in, is actually a late understanding that reflects the challenges of the time around, well, Jesus and the Gospels, right? If you've seen those movies, including Life of Brian, you know just how fractious that society was. It was not seemingly so in 600 BCE, just before the Babylonians, right? But that was the persistent injustice that the prophets rallied against. And that's Isaiah, again this morning, wagging the finger. So, I introduced that because a modern Orthodox Manhattan leader, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, had a beautiful piece in the foreword. You know, many of these are public, so perhaps you saw this, but I trust there's, it's always a teacup to a fire hose of the good stuff that's out there. And Chaim Steinmetz told the story about at his yeshiva growing up, that he and his roommate, and they were literally boys. This was like a high school boarding school yeshiva. Got into some small tiff early in their year and managed to go the entire year somehow with grunting and not talking. That this little thing just got deeper and deeper, and it took both of their willingnesses. And then ultimately took both of their willingnesses to step out of something that clearly was never worth it. And yet all that time had gone by and all that damage was done. And he continues with text number 3. So Martha, if you would, and maybe a volunteer online, since y'all can read and I think we all can hear, and we have the text in front of us in nice big print for number 3. Someone willing? Someone online, perhaps? Can I hear you if you say yes? Martha,
I'll
can
read.
you unmute? Excellent, thank you.
The personal is political this Tisha B'Av. Rav Chaim Steinmetz. While righteously fighting the hatred of the wicked, we too often remain blind to the powerful role hatred plays in our own lives. Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temple, is a time to contemplate the power of senseless hatred. The fall of the Second Commonwealth was as much a result of internecine Jewish infighting as it was of Roman military strength. The simplest interpretation of this history is that political fractionalism leads to communal division. However, the Talmud takes a deeper perspective. It tells the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, a dinner party that goes terribly wrong.
So,
The
BJ,
host
just
is
hold for just a second. I'm curious, how many people have heard or remember this story? Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. I taught it at a retreat a number of years ago. It's one of these classics of rabbinic literature, but of course there's so much out there that if it comes up once in 10 years in the life of the shul, that's a lot. So Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, as if they are father and son, right? Because Bar Kamsa means the son of Kamsa. They otherwise have the same exact last name. Some interpretations actually say perhaps this was an estranged father and son. In other cases, these are, it's just one of those things where those kids got mixed up too many times in school and decided they hated each other, just like Chaim Steinmetz's yeshiva story. But this one has massive consequences because this dinner party is in the year 66 of the Common Era, which is just as the Roman crush, the revolt, but the crushing of it is about to unfold. Please continue, BJ.
The host is a good friend of Kamsa's, but the invitation is mistakenly delivered to the host's enemy, Bar Kamsa. He then shows up at the banquet, filled with the who's who of Jerusalem. The host demands Bar Kamsa leave immediately, hoping to avoid embarrassment. Bar Kamsa offers to pay the host for the entire banquet as long as he can stay. The host refuses to bend and publicly humiliates Bar Kamsa. In his fury, Bar Kamsa decides to take revenge against the banquet guests and offers a false accusation against the Jews of Jerusalem to the Roman government. The Talmud says that Bar Kamsa's accusation ultimately caused the destruction of Jerusalem. In this remarkable Talmudic text, the political is upstaged by the personal. The Talmud ignores sectarian infighting and instead focuses on an everyday conflict. Like the proverbial butterfly, one personal battle can stir up a hurricane of destruction. Even though Bar Kamsa had every reason to be aggrieved, he responded to hatred with more hatred. The lesson is that if people feel justified in hating others, no matter how righteous the cause, they can contribute to destroying society as well. Alas, hatred is a natural passion common to all human beings. The idea that hatred is the result of a personality defect is a dangerous myth. There's plenty of idealistic, self-righteous hatred as well. Tisha B'Av arrives this year at a time of intense polarization. Snark and spite have replaced civil debate in the news and on social media, and from there it has migrated to our Passover seders and Shabbat tables. This fury is inescapable. I feel drawn into it every time I go online. Undoubtedly, there are big picture reasons for our polarization, but if we stopped there, we would fail in our analysis. We need to look in the mirror and realize that there's a Bar Kamsa inside every one of us. And until we all take responsibility, polarization will remain.
Thank you.
I just think
Well, a very important backstory to the destruction, right? This was written about the Babylonian destruction, but of course, the date was anchored in our collective imagination only after the downfall of the Second Temple at the hands of the Romans. And this is one of the rabbi's backstories. And we're about to get a dissent, but it is worth holding on to Rav Steinmetz's core idea here, that as important as our political disagreements may be, and as challenging as it may be to try to disagree agreeably, right? That sometimes we can all, on all sides of a conflict, find ourselves spewing more negativity and more hatred than we need to. And sometimes that's even in the context of rivalries and interpersonal relationships that need not have gone as far south as they have. So that's the larger point, and we can certainly take issue with pieces of it. George?
This Bubba Mike is nice. And I respect it to a point, but I don't think you can understand or deal with the kinds of intra-communal hatred that we see now, and that's on a mass scale, with stories about this one and that one. That's not how I see the world now. I may be suffering from some kind of blindness. My wife tells me I do get it wrong from time to time. But I just think the kind of I mean, look at these lunatics who are running around and telling us that the election results that have been certified are untrue, they're false. That's ripping us apart, and it's making it impossible to get legislation done that to remedy the things that are making people feel terribly aggrieved in great numbers. And I just, these guys in the Senate, they talk about how nice they are to one another in the back. And indeed they may be, but that isn't where it's at.
So the balance of righteous indignation and it's really the old justice versus mercy, right? That these midot, these values in God and in us, are sometimes in conflict. And our judgment and sense of justice is very clear. We know where the blame lies. We know who's heading the country in the wrong direction. The mercy piece, at its best, can temper that. It doesn't necessarily minimize the strength with which we hold those principles, but it may minimize the vitriol with which we spout forth our opinions. We're not going to adjudicate this tonight, but I want to just leave Rob Steinmetz's question on the table. Even when we have data saying our side is right, are there ways that we can be part of depolarizing? Are there ways we can bring down the volume? and generate more light than heat? A real question, perhaps. Food for thought, perhaps with your loved ones tomorrow, as Tisha B'Av unfolds. Chapter 3, this is the last one that we're going to read in its fullness, yes? Okay, and it's not much longer than chapter 2, except it's divided into lots of really short verses, so it looks like a lot. What I want to just remind us that's so interesting about chapter 3 of Eicha, it's of course the middle of 5 chapters, and in the middle of this, it's like a different author steps in, as if to say, just like Leviticus, arguably the least exciting of the books and the third out of 5, and in the middle of Leviticus, we get all those ethical pieces of the holiness code that are so relevant in the middle of the middle. So it is here, some of the Bible's strongest language about hope. And I'm not going to say optimism because it's not simply sit back and things will be okay, but with agency, there is hope, is right here in the middle of Lamentations. It maybe needed a little bit better editing in order to get that in there somehow. And maybe the biblical author just thought we couldn't sit with 5 straight chapters of all this sadness, that we need a little dose of hope in the middle. And that's what we're going to get. So chapter 3 itself has 3 parts. Be open to the sadness, be open to the hope in the middle, and then be open to being brought back to remembrance and tragedy at the end. Perek Gimel.
אני הגבר רעני בשבט עברתו, אותי נהג ויולך חושך ולא אור, אך פי ישוב יהפוך ידו כל היום. בילה בשרי ואורי, שיבר עצמותי, בונה עלי ויקח ראש ותלאה, במחשכים הושיבני כמתי עולם. גדר בדי ולא אצא, הכביד נחשתי, גם כי אזעק ואשבע סתם תפילתי. גדר דרכי בגזית, נתיבותי עיוור. דוב עורב הוא לי, ארי במסתרים. דרכי סורר ויפשחני, צמני שומם. דרך קשתו ויציבני, כמטרה לחץ. הביא בכליותי בני אשפתו, הייתי שחוק לחמי, נגינתם כל היום. השביעני ואמרורים, הרבני לענה. ויגרס בחוצת שיני, הכפישני באפר. ותזנח משלום נפשי, נעשיתי טובה. ואומר עובד נצחי, ותאכלתי מאדוני. זכר עניי ומרודי, לענה וראש. זכור תזכור ותשוח עלי נפשי. זאת אשיב אל ליבי, al kain ochil. Chaste Adonai kilo tomnu, kilo cholu rachamav. Kadoshim labrakim, rabba emunatecha. Chelki Adonai amra nafshi, al kain ochilo. Tov Adonai lekovav, lenefesh tidrashenu. Tov v'yochil v'dumam, l'tshuat Adonai. Tov lagever ki yisor, al bin urav. Yeshev badod v'yitom, ki nata olav. Yitain be'afar pihu, ulai yesh tikva. Yitain lamakehu lechi, yispa bechir pa. Kilo yiznach lolam, kilo yiznach leolam adon. No. Adonai, ki im hoka v'richam, kerov chastav, hilo ina milibo, v'yageh b'nei ish. L'dakei tachat raglav, kol asirei aretz, lahatot mishpat gever, neged pnei elyon, le'avet adam brito, Adonai lo ra'ah. Mize omar vatehi, Adonai lo tziva, mi pi elyon lo tetze, haraot v'hatov. Ma yit onen adam chai, gever al chataav. Nach pesad derachenu v'nach korah, v'noshuvu ad Adonai. Nisa livavenu el kapayim, el bashamayim. Nachnu poshanu umorinu, ata lo solachta. Sakota va'af vatir defenu, haragta lo chomalta. Sakota va'anan lach, me avor tefillah. Schi umaos tisimenu bekerev ha'amim. Potsu olenu pihem kol oivenu. Pochad v'fachad hayalanu hashet v'hashaver. Halgemayim tered enai. Al shever bat ami. Ini nikra v'lo tidmer me'en hafugot. Ad yashkif vayere Adonai min hashamayim. Ini olala l'nafshi mikol benot iri. Sod soduni katzipor oivai chinam. Sam tu vabor chayai vayadu even bihi. Sofumayim aroshi omarti nigzarti. Karati shimcha Adonai mibor tachtiyot. Koli shamato al talem oznecha lerav Chati Lishav Ati Korata Biyum Ekra Ech Amarto Al Tira Ravta Adonai Rive Nafshi Go'alta Chayai Ra'ita Adonai Avatati Shafta Mishpati Ra'ita Kol Nikmatam Kol Machshavotam Li Shomata Chirpatam Adonai Kol Machshavotam Olai Sifte Komai Vehegunam Olai Kol Hayom Shivtam Vikirmatam Habita Ani Manginatam Tashiv Lahem Kumul Adonai Kemaaseh Yedehem Titain Lahem Mikinat Lev Ta'alatcha Lahem Tirdof Ba'af V'Tashmidim Mitachat Shmei Adonai.
Asher Koach, Larry. Thank you. So, in the middle, the striking verse, Ulai yesh tikva. Perhaps there is hope. And then the end, echoing the psalmist, simply, hear my prayer, left unanswered in chapter 3.
Yeah, there's something else,
Yes.
is that the end to hear the prayer is pursue them in anger and destroy them. Certainly, there's a lot of hatred in that.
Yes. Again, echoing the psalmist, right? The Psalm 137, that's the beautiful beginning of, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her cunning, ends asking God to strike our enemies' babies on the rocks. So vengeance is an understandable human emotion and even canonized in our sacred text, there and here and elsewhere. So yes.
The inconsistent perhaps with the idea that we shouldn't have unbridled hatred.
Mhm.
This is certainly unbridled hatred.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Point very well taken. And every time we just finished the book of Numbers, thank God, but replete through it all are just command after command to dispossess those who were there. And in some cases, quite literally, a mitzvah, a commandment to commit genocide, as against the Midianites, as against the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Perizzites, etc. It's a painful piece of our history, and we talk about it plenty on those Shabbatot. And we think about the famous Midrash at the shore of the Red Sea, when the people had just been through the ringer of slavery, and they are rejoicing seeing the enemy's downfall. It is the angels who are shushed for singing because they should know better. But it's like a recognition of human limitations of our compassion. So.
Yeah, isn't it true that this whole business about not being hateful, isn't that a rabbinical sort of take on what had happened? Whereas my understanding of Lamentations, of Eicha, is that it's an amazing piece of poetry of somebody experiencing the most awful experience that a human being can undergo. So it's poetry of the human experience under those conditions. So we're not trying to be goody-goody in this poetry, but we're trying to really give voice to this human experience. So I think it's totally vengeance, whatever it is that there is, God doesn't exist. I mean, I just think it's really good to actually give voice to that because it's so true.
And I would just say, you're right, and you're right. Right? Larry is absolutely right that the range of human experience needs to be recognized, and even from a therapeutic lens, how important it is to get the honest feelings out if we're ever going to clean up the messier of those feelings. They need to be named first. And we do have to clean up the messier of those feelings, because once it is in the biblical text and is being waved around as proof text for all kinds of actions in the present day, we do have a legacy that we need to struggle with. So, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hen. These and these are the words of the living God. Text number 2, Martha, going backwards. We are actually in the home stretch. Our remaining pieces of text are small, and so are the pieces of Eicha. 3 paragraphs from Rabbi Ellen Bernstein, who really founded the modern Jewish environmental movement in the basement of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in 1988, founding Shomrei Adama, who reminds us that when the temple is destroyed, we are remembering a building, but that building mythically is connected in our tradition to the Garden of Eden. And so even though the built environment and nature are often at odds with each other, that there's a parallel between the loss of one and the loss of the other. So before we have a snippet at the end of chapter 4 that gets us right in Jerusalem in 586 BCE, witnessing the destruction of this holy place, we think about the destruction of this holy place and its parallel. A volunteer, online or in person? Excellent. Dinah will read for us from Rabbi Ellen Bernstein. Go ahead.
The temple in Jerusalem has always been associated with the Garden of earthly delight. In Ezekiel's vision, a river flowed out from under the temple, and gigantic trees grew along the banks of the river. And wherever the river flowed, fish were bountiful, and the plants flourished, freely giving their food and medicines. What better description of paradise? The temple and the garden were then one and the same. The temple is an icon of the garden, and the garden is an icon of the earth. The text we read on Tisha B'Av, Eicha, Lamentations, is a montage of devastating and gruesome images of the suffering that comes to an entire people when the temple and the city of Jerusalem go up in flames. As poetry, the language of Lamentations invites our minds to roam and make associations. When I hear the word temple, my mind jumps to the Garden of Eden and then to the earth and the suffering that the earth and all of us are facing as we are caught in the whirlwinds of our changing climate. Out of the darkness, someone begins to chant the mournful yet exquisitely poignant melody of Eicha, the text of Lamentations. Heads bowed, we read the words by the light of our candles. Curiously, the Hebrew word that begins the lament, Eicha, echoes the word Ayecha from the Garden of Eden story linking these stories. Ayecha is translated as, where are you? When God cries out, Ayecha, God is confronting Adam and Eve, who are hiding from God, shirking their responsibility. In the book of Lamentations, the term Eicha translates to a mournful complaint. How is it possible? When I read the word Echa in light of Ayecha, I hear, how? How could you let this happen to my precious garden, my earth, my creatures, my peoples?
So perhaps even more than in the previous example, where sometimes acknowledge our own complicity when it's so clear that the other side is wrong, right? As feels the case in the political realm. In the environmental realm, it's a little harder to point the finger outward, when in fact we ourselves and our ways of life, unchecked, are readily acknowledged as part of the challenge. So how could you let this happen to my precious garden, my earth, my creatures, my peoples? That's our cry when we look at corporations or political parties that are not moving as fast as we wish they were. But maybe that's God's cry, looking even at us and saying, have you done enough? The destruction is poignantly outlined in chapters 4 and 5 in almost increasingly graphic and painful detail. So just a snippet at the end of chapter 4, I believe we're starting at verse 17, that was it? And again, thank you, Ken. Chapter 4, verse 17 to the end.
Odenu tichlena einenu el ezratenu havel b'tzifiatenu tzipinu el goy lo Yoshia tzadu tzadenu milechet b'chovotenu karav kitzenu Mal'u yameinu kiva kitenu kalim hayu rodfenu minishre shamayim al heharim delakunu bamidbar arulanu ruach apenu Mashiach Adonai nilkad B'shchintotam asher amarnu batzilo nichye v'goyim. Sisi v'simchi bat Edom yoshevet be'eretz Ut. Gam alayich ta'ava kukos tishkli v'tidari. Tam avonech batzion Lo Yossi lahaglotech Fakad onech bat Edom Gila ahatotayim.
Thank you. So you hear the move that the author is making again, as in chapter 3, that mixed in with the devastation is the idea that this has to be enough. This has to be it. Surely, almost plaintively, right? Surely, O Zion, you have paid for your sins, and this will be the last time, right? The irony, of course, this is being written about the destruction of the first temple when we are here remembering both and more. And that same move in chapter 5. We look near the very end of the book. One of the lines that is so often thought of is verse 16. Just a few lines from the bottom. Nafla ateret roshenu, oy nalanu ki chatanu. The crown from our heads has fallen. Oy, woe to us, for we have sinned. The acknowledgement that there was shortcoming at our end, and it has resulted in us losing
that sense of connection with the ultimate royalty, and the crown has fallen from our heads. The Kabbalists, of course, do a lot with that because of the symbolism of crown and all that it contains. So we look from there. For all this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyesight is dim. Foxes roam about the desolate mountain of Zion. There's a famous story in the Talmud about two rabbis walking in Jerusalem and seeing the ruins, and there's a fox. And one of them starts crying, quoting this verse, and the other finds a way to say that means that the redemption is already in the works, that's proof that the worst has already happened. And you, God, shall reign forever. So from that image of desolation back to a place of affirmation of connection as best we possibly can. Ata Adonai leolam teshev kisecha ledor vador. Lama lanetzach tishkachenu, right? Like, surely you're not forgetting us forever. And yet that's our experience. So it is also accurately translated, why do you forget us forever, forsake us for so long? And then verse 21, Hashivenu. We have sinned, we have done wrong. Did the Babylonians do wrong? Yes. Did the Edomites do wrong? Yes. Did the insurrectionists on January 6th do wrong? Yes. Did ExxonMobil do wrong? Yes. But what about us in every one of those?
What about us? I would like to ask that question. What about us?
What about us?
How much do we take on the responsibility of also sinning in this situation to talk to George and to focus on the present? How much responsibility shall we take on ourselves to cause what's going on right now? I'm befuddled. I mean, that's an easy word to use right now. I could think of a better, but I'm befuddled about it. What did I do? What did I do? How did we get to this point? And I think about this every day. This is getting worse and worse every day. So I take it very, very seriously. What do we not do? We could talk about that as well.
Yeah. So in case you couldn't hear the distance, Patty, echoing George's question and echoing what I'm putting out there of where is our iniquity? And I want to find it. I want to figure out a way I can do better, but it's hard. And I will admit, on that scale, it's hardest in the political polarization of the moment, when one side has data and the other side has QAnon, right? But again, that's part of why I keep bringing in the environmental as an example, where even the enlightened among us who get the data, none of us is living low enough to be within our appropriate share of a global carbon budget. No one in American upper middle class does. There is so much unsustainability that we partake in every single day. So maybe that's a clearer example in the now.
But the history of
Actually, with apologies, we're getting to 9:30, and this was meant to be an intro to the final verse of Lamentations. This is a conversation that should continue. So have it this evening, have it with your loved ones. And how perfect, because my phone's at 5%, so we better wrap up. Wow, amazing how the stars align. So again, a moment ago, we said, we have sinned, and thus the crown has fallen from our heads.
And that is the place from which we say the line that becomes central in High Holy Days and central in 3 or 4 times a week, whenever we take out the Torah. Hashivenu, cause us to return. It's like our higher selves saying, God, I know I'm stuck. I know I don't do enough tshuva. I know that my cheshbon hanefesh, my looking in my deeds and my midot, my attributes, is not consistent or thorough enough. So my higher self is asking you to help my whole self turn. Hashivenu. My broken self is saying, please cause us to return. Adonai Elecha, O God, to you, Vinashuva. And with your help, we will shuv, we will turn. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, renew our days. And we could talk forever about what Kekedem means, like east, like old, like the best of the good old, all of that. And then, as tradition so often does, we want to end on a good note, and yet we have that creative tension. The author was not content to leave it there with that happy feeling of we do tshuva and it will be enough. Ki imma osma astanu katsafta alinu ad ma'od. You have utterly rejected us. Oi, have you been angry? It's almost like a machloket, a disagreement for the ages. Do we end with Hashivenu, or do we end where the book ends? So we say Hashivenu, and then we say that last line, it's not all bread and roses. And then we sing Hashivenu again. Only with the recognition of our frailty and the seriousness of this verse can we sing it properly this once a year when it comes up in original context. The last line, or really the second to last line. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva. Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedem. One more time if the battery doesn't run out. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva. Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kekedem. This morning, Martha, our Zoom Gabbai, got us going, thinking about Tisha B'Av and Sinat Chinam, senseless hatred. We're going to let Martha have the last word. It's number 4 on your handout or your screen. If we run out, this is at ritualwell.org. I'll read quickly. Psalm for Tisha B'Av, written just this season. When your temples are destroyed, your people murdered by enemies of truth, we fall to our knees in ashes and dust. We rend our clothing, cry psalms of lament. Adonai, Adonai, why have you forsaken us? Why have you given us
like sheep to slaughter. The valley of the shadow is deep and wide. We fear evil. The angel of death does not heed the signs on our doorposts or on our gates. By the rivers of Babylon, in the Warsaw Ghetto, in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, Shekhinah sits Shiva with us in ashes and dust. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ruach haolam yotzer or uvorech choshech. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, creator of light and darkness. We will mourn, but then we will rise to write new prayers and sing new songs. We will turn dust and ashes into fertile earth. Adonai, Adonai, God of compassion, you weep with us in the darkest night, but raise us in joy in morning's light. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be. If you just screen down a little more, Martha, sorry. For anyone who missed it, 1 o'clock tomorrow, the Inside Out Wisdom and Action Project, Iowa, of Rabbi David Jaffe, a modern Orthodox Mussar master, with a Black Lives Matter focus through the experience of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice organizer, Jew of color leader, Yehuda Webster, after George Floyd's murder, calling for sort of public tshuva. There's a film and then a discussion that goes into the Mussar and the communal elements. And there's a whole Tisha B'Av connection. It's going to be screened at 1 o'clock with a panel afterwards. The Reconstructionist Movement is a co-sponsor of this. And you sign up either through Reconstructionist or at insideoutwisdomandaction.org. Hope to see many of you there as well. A little bit like Hashivenu, we say one more thing and then we go back to the penultimate. You weep with us in the darkest night, but raise us in joy in morning's light. Ken Yehi Ratzon, Erev Tov. Martha, thank you again. Okay. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, BJ.
Okay, good night.
Good night.